Thank you. I appreciate the introduction, and I have indeed had to make some serious adjustments. My office is at my home, and field work will be done, at least initially, out of my garage. In any case, I thank all the rest of you for being with me this evening. We're going to talk a little bit about a pretty hot topic, which is how we're going to get past fertilizer prices being the way they are, and how we might manage soils a little bit differently in these times that we're in. Just to start off, the latest DTN retail price survey, which was as of April the 5th, the next one's actually coming out tomorrow, has some fairly serious prices, some of which have actually increased a little bit, even since last month. Anhydrous is up to an all-time high. Urea and UAN are also at all-time highs, and so is DAP. Potash actually went down just a little bit from the peak of last month, but from the direct 4-week time back, it's up about 3%. You can see those prices in both dollars per ton on the slide as well as dollars per pound. Probably the one that's been the most difficult to deal with for many producers has been UAN, followed by DAP and potash, particularly for forage producers. I will say this DTN retail price survey doesn't have many places in Kentucky. So in Kentucky, we're finding that local prices are actually sometimes better depending on how close to the river you are, or sometimes they're worse. What this forces all of us to do is think about how we're going to improve our nutrient use efficiency to get more bang for the fertilizer buck. And it still basically boils down to the thing that we've been talking about for a decade or better, which are the 4 R's: getting the right rate, timing, source, and placement of the nutrients in order to maximize their use efficiency by the crops we're growing. There are lots of interactions among the 4 R's, and those depend on the situation, and that is especially true with nitrogen. And those have not become less important this particular season. The first thing the grower has to do is consider the current limitations. Are there other nutrient resources that they might be able to utilize? Machinery, or people? What are the logistics of moving nutrients or other nutrient sources around? And there might be worth making some adjustments given the situation we're in. I'm going to start with what we don't want to do, which is don't use last year's nutrient removal as a guide. Start with a soil test. And I think soil testing has become ever more important in years like this. I know some people are on 2-year or 3-year soil test rotations, but following the results of the soil test are critically important. Nutrient removal estimates, which we see sometimes when people take yield monitor data, multiply it by some book value for NP or K, and they get an estimate of the removal, and then they try to use that as a soil test or as a prescription for fertilizer. The problem is you can get false positives. You can get areas where you're going to apply fertilizer where, in fact, if you did a soil test, they would be high and you wouldn't need any. And you can get false negatives where the yield was truly being reduced by a low level of a nutrient, but you do your calculation using the book value, and now you've got a low yield times the book value, and you don't apply nearly enough fertilizer to cover the loss. All that said, I know that soil testing is not perfect, that every field is somewhat fertility unique, but I do argue it's especially important to soil test on the fields that need it when the fertilizer prices are high, because it allows you to target lime and fertilizer application to the fields that have the greater potential for an economic or profitable response. I'm not going to get into the weeds on soil sampling, but basically we recommend a composite of 15 to 20 cores for each area, 4 inches deep for no-till pastures and hay fields, or to the primary tillage depth from fields that are still being tilled, is the most important step in the soil testing process. That sample has to be representative, both on an area basis, on a depth basis, to reflect where the roots are going to extract the needed nutrients. So what are we going to look at first? Well, I want to look at soil pH, this particular example. This is, by the way, the new UK soil test report. I don't think every county is on this system, but this is the one that will be the one being used. Soil pH is the thing I want to look at. In this particular example, which for soybean, it's not very low or low, but it is medium. So what are we going to do here? Well, what I'm going to say we're going to do is we're going to, I'm not advancing here. Let me go to, okay, now I'm advancing. We're going to want to keep the pH between 6 and 7. Probably for soybeans, a little on the higher side, 6.5, 6.6 would be a little bit better. And one of the major reasons we're going to do this is there's a strong relationship between soil pH and the availability of the nutrients that are currently in the soil. These bands go across. We start at a low pH down here at 4 up to a pH of 10, which neither one of those occur very much in our soils. But you can see that there's some differences in the width of these bands for the different nutrient elements. Well, the bottom line is that these nutrient elements, the wider the band, the greater the availability. And you can see that range between 6 and 7 captures most of the wide portions of the bands for each one of those nutrient elements. One of the other nice things about this particular season is that ag lime has been widely available across the state. There have been a very few notable price increases in the price of the lime. There have been some price increases due to the cost of diesel fuel lately to do the delivery and application. But that does mean that liming acid soils is for this year a high priority. Maintaining an optimal nutrient availability for all crops, given the P and zinc that the pH is very strongly related to, and in our soils it's critical. We want to make sure we have the pH right. With soybeans, we want to maintain their growth and nitrogen fixation. And in general, the soil biology and soil chemistry are just better in that mid 6 to 7 pH range, so that the crop recovers those nutrients, and that makes it better for your bank account. The one downside about agricultural lime is that you need time for the reaction. And this talk is a little bit late to do much liming for the current upcoming crop. But if you need to have lime, you need to get it on, because there's always some finer material that's going to be in the batch of lime you get, and that will react relatively quickly. And if your soil is fairly acid, that will be helpful in the current season. We're going to move on to cover phosphate, potash, and then a little bit about nitrogen. In this particular sample, we've got a phosphorus soil test of 50 pounds per acre, and that's considered a medium test. And we got potassium at only 150 pounds per acre, and that's kind of low. So that means we've got to do some things, and we got to consider each of these separately. You don't want to think about them in a year like this. You don't want to think about them together. You want to think about them separately. We want to use the soil test to adjust the rates of the P and K that we're applying. The rate is the easiest to adjust by far of what we do. Timing and placement are more difficult. We want to put what is needed where it's needed. And the reason we want to do that is because the probability of a yield or economic response is strongly related to soil test level. The soil test, if it's very low, low to mid-medium, we have a much higher probability of a positive response than we do if we get mid-medium high to very high. This figure comes out of a kind of a textbook, classic textbook on the relationship between levels of soil fertility and the probability of an economic crop response. You can see in the figure up above, very low, you have a pretty good probability. And by the time you get to high, it's pretty poor. It's not zero. There are always going to be these odd situations where even though the soil test said it was high, you get a response. And that's what your neighbor will sometimes tell you is why they don't like soil testing. But the bottom line is the probability of that is pretty low, particularly if you're taking a representative soil sample. But by the time you hit medium, you're down around 40%. So that's not exactly bad, but it's not the situation where in a year like this, we're going to recommend a whole lot more P and K. Part of the reason for this is what we call the law of diminishing returns. When prices are high and salt test levels show mid, medium, or better availability, you don't have a good large increment of yield that you're going to get by adding more phosphate or potash fertilizer in that mid, medium to high range. So you probably shouldn't be adding it. The law of diminishing return is not the whole story. There's also what we call the probability of a response. This is a set of data where a whole set of yield data were taken across fields, and they were compared pairwise. So you have the salt test level along that x-axis, and what was the yield difference between where the fertilizer was added and where it wasn't added. You can see over on the left that most of the yields are in the positive when it was very low, and there's still most of them in the positive where it's low. There's some where it wasn't. There were other factors at that particular comparison site that caused the yield to be lower on the fertilized side. But once you get into this medium range and you get into the high range, you don't have a very good probability of a response. Notice the fields that were chosen for this were mostly in the low region. They weren't very many in the very low or very many in the medium or high. But certainly it shows the trend that you're not likely to get a great response if you're in that high, medium to high range. So in our particular example, we have phosphorus in the medium, and UK recommends, according to AGR1, 30 pounds of P2O5, and potassium is in the low range, and it recommends 90. What does this mean in practice? Well, it means if you look at the phosphate, you're up in what we call the maintenance rate. 50 pounds per acre is in the midpoint of this range between 40 and 60, and there's 20 salt test units here, all of them getting this maintenance rate. All these other increments down here are much smaller than 20 salt test units, and that's where they broke out rates for all those individual smaller increments. Over here, where the potash is at 148, it's in about the midpoint of this range, and you got 90 pounds of K2O is recommended, and that's significantly more than maintenance and represents a significant need for this field. If we look at our soybean table, soybean was our example, clearly when UK gets into the high range, which is greater than 60 pounds P and 300 pounds K, the recommendation is 0. Other labs are going to make recommendations here, but our maintenance rate is actually in this region. 30. If you see on your UK soil test report 30 pounds of P2O5 or 30 pounds of K2O, that really does represent the maintenance rate. I know a lot of people thought UK was conservative, but there's always been this maintenance region built in to the recommendations since I came here in 1981. Areas below it have either maintenance plus some buildup, this is in the mid-medium on down range, or maintenance plus a heavier buildup in low to very low, because we know that some of the fertilizer, in order to maintain nutrient availability, you have to add some additional, and that's why the rates tend to go up at these lower soil test levels. So if the soil test is greater than 60 or greater than 300, no P or K fertilizer is recommended. But in that 40 to 60 salt test P or 242 to 300 salt test K, that's where the maintenance P and K fertilizer is recommended. And right now in the seasons we're in, it's less affordable. And therefore, my colleagues, Dr. Ritchie and Dr. McGrath, we all three recommend that particular thing for this year be set at 0. It's not what the lab's going to report because they don't have the time to readjust their computer output, but that's what the lab's going to that's what we're going to recommend you do. Well, if we look at corn, things look a little different here, but it's 46 to 60 instead of 40. And the reason for that is corn is more sensitive to phosphate deficiency. So the maintenance rate is deliberately set a few salt test P points higher. It starts at 46, not at 40. However, for potash, it's still the same. It really is 242 to 300. That's all at that rate of 30 pounds of K2O is the recommended rate. And then the others are correspondingly maintenance plus some buildup in the low medium range and maintenance plus a heavier buildup in the other two categories. Same story. We're recommending that in this particular region where you have a corn recommendation, we're recommending you go to 0 for this season. We also would recommend that, particularly if we have a great year and you pull a lot of nutrients off with high yields, that you soil test again to make sure you know where you are for the 2023 season. This is an example of a lab report from another laboratory. Up here in the upper left corner, we have the soil test P, which is 199. It's also in pounds per acre, by the way, and 344 soil test K. Now, for these, UK would recommend nothing. This particular lab makes a maintenance recommendation, even at 199 pounds of soil test P, of 60 pounds of P2O5. They also make a recommendation of 80 pounds of potash at a soil test K of 344. That's even less affordable this year than it would have been previously. There is a philosophy that says, I want to have a high or higher level of fertility in my soil, and I like to have the nutrients in my soil. Generally, the philosophy of the soil bank account was pretty badly attacked by a colleague of mine who's passed away named Grant Thomas. And he concluded that the soil bank account never pays interest. In fact, losses of nutrients due to fixation, erosion, all cause negative interest, and the chemical and the biological uncertainty makes that soil fertilizer bank much less valuable than leaving the dollars in the bank. Doses of fertilizer you need are much more efficient than doses of maintenance fertilizer. Small doses of maintenance, just to make sure you might be covering some parts of the field where the soil sample might have missed a spot that was lowish. Not a bad idea, but not these higher rates at these higher soil test levels. Moving on to some of the source questions and timing and placement, there hasn't been much change in potassium sources, except that Mosaic offers a product called Aspire, particularly for alfalfa producers, which is muriate of potash plus boron. They also offer a micro essentials product where they took a product that's basically like MAP and they add sulfur to it, plus the micronutrient of your choice. They have a boron version, a zinc version, and a copper version. If you need these added nutrients, Nutrien, by the way, is also making a new product like this. If you need these added nutrients, that's fine. They are co-prilled together in such a way that every prill contains the same analysis, and it's a better way in some cases of getting a more effective nutrient distribution in the field from low rate nutrients like boron and zinc. There are no other chemical or microbial additives that are claiming to replace phosphate or potassium are holding up in terms of what I've seen from university research done either by us or by others. We've looked at Avail for phosphorus and have seen nothing. It's now being marketed by Verdesian. Poultry litter is a good product if you can get it. Right now it's pretty pricey, and I think a lot of sources have been locked up in terms of getting litter. You need to get an analysis, and you really need to use it particularly on fields where you need all the nutrients in it. If you've already got a medium-high test in P and K and all you need is the nitrogen, you might want to move it to say a cornfield where you could use nitrogen and P and K. DAP is also getting to be a big problem. About $400 per ton of the DAP price is in the nitrogen. If you put that on in the fall, or if you put it on last fall, you don't have much chance of getting the value of the nitrogen out of it. And that's a pretty high price to pay for nitrogen you're not going to get. I'm strongly recommending that producers across the state start asking their retailer for triple superphosphate for next fall. There are a number of companies, Koch and OCP, are bringing TSP into the country or manufacturing it here. So I do think Kentucky is a little low on this material in terms of its availability. A lot of us are using DAP, but I do think if we're going to put on P in the fall, we want to get more bang for the buck. We don't want to pay for nitrogen. We need to think about asking for TSP. In terms of placement, we have both pre-plant broadcast and at-plant banding, but that's if you have the equipment. 2x2 phosphorus, I'm not going to talk about in furrow because that's a very small rate of P. 2x2, you can deal with some of these higher maintenance plus extra P recommendations at 1/3 to 1/2 of the broadcast rate if you have that capability. You do have to be remembering, though, that in a 2x2 situation, the nitrogen plus the K2O has to be 100 pounds or less to avoid salt injury. In our soils, even 2 inches away, if you exceed 100 pounds of N plus K2O per acre, you can see some salt influence, reduced rates of seedling emergence. Occasionally, weaker seeds just don't produce a plant. So it's something to consider. All right, we're going to move on here to nitrogen. The two things to remember about nitrogen is that rate and timing are strongly linked together. And the earlier you apply the larger portion of your N, the more that rate has to be. I know that our springs are getting warmer, and they're definitely been getting wetter these past 10 years. And we all want to plant corn early. But when do we put on the N? We've always said that on moderately well-drained to poorly drained soils, rates of nitrogen can be reduced by at least 35 pounds of nitrogen per acre. Right now, that's about $40. If as much as 2/3 of that nitrogen is delayed 4 to 6 weeks after planting. We tell people to plan to split or delay your nitrogen on as many acres as you can. That includes the well-drained ones with these wet years we've been having. But you want to start that plan with your wettest acres because those are the ones where it's most beneficial. And those are the ones for which those windows of application are going to be the smallest in these wet seasons we've been having. That said, you may want to have a pretty good chunk of N go on early. And that might need a nitrification inhibitor to hold it as long as possible for the benefit of the crop. And if you're using urea as your delayed N source, top dressed, you may want to put a urease inhibitor with it. If you're going to put UAN or urea on the surface, and I don't care whether you're broadcasting it or dribbling it, in the case of UAN, a urease inhibitor might be beneficial if you're not going to get rain within a couple, 3 days. This is the result of a study that was completed last year. There were 6 dryland locations. And the first thing I want to show here is what we call the treatment description. All these sites were either well-drained or moderately well-drained. There were no wet soils here. But my conviction was, when I did this study, it didn't really matter. We were going to look at, the real question was, what kind of splitting is the best split to make? So the 6 treatments here are no nitrogen early, and early was defined as at planting. That's treatment 2. So the 160 total units went on at V8. Now V8 in this case is 8 collars. That's actually about a 13 to 14 inch corn plant, and you're going to have 8 collars and at least 10 leaves, okay? So the treatment 2 is 40 pounds at plant, 120 V8. 40 pounds at V2, 2 collars, 40 pounds at V4, 4 collars, and 40 pounds at V6, 6 collars. And then, just to see whether 160 was really needed, I added a treatment where there was 120 put on at V8. Sites averaged somewhere around 170 bushel corn up to about 260 bushel corn. And the interesting thing is, for most of the study, at most of the locations, it didn't make a dime's worth of difference. I could have put that nitrogen on anywhere in there, and it would have done exactly the same yield. There were 2 locations where there were differences. Site 5, which is one of the higher yielding sites, 3rd highest overall, it paid to have 40 pounds at plant along with 120 at V8. That's the only one of the 6 where that happened. And then at site 6, 120 was clearly not enough. That was the highest yielding location, 260 bushel corn. And it needed 160 pounds of N one way or another in order for it to maximize yield. 120 wasn't going to cut it. Nitrogen sources remain pretty much the same, but in Kentucky, not all of the sources are equally available across the state. Anhydrous is more available in the western part of the state than it is in the east. UAN is also a little bit more available west and central than it is if you get further east. So sometimes the logistics of that change what you can do. There are a lot of source by placement combinations for nitrogens. Some of those kind of lock you in terms of equipment. Anhydrous must be placed below the surface. You can't leave any of that on the surface. But top-dressed urea is always on the surface. I will say this, there are a couple different ways of dealing with losses when we're working with nitrogen. We've got a number of ways we can modify the source. We can add some loss inhibitors to do this. You want to use these though, because they add cost somewhere between 5 to 15 cents per pound. Okay, they're not cheap. You want to use them only when a particular loss potential is substantial. For example, ureavolatilization loss is pretty low if it's going to rain within 2 to 3 days. And it's also pretty low with UAN that's injected below the surface. So you don't need to worry about UAN placed below the surface in terms of a volatilization loss. Now you may, depending on when you time that UAN below the surface, you may need to consider using a nitrification inhibitor to prevent it from being lost when soils turn soggy. Denitrification loss is less when nitrogen is split or delayed applied. So UAN might work better if you waited 4 to 6 weeks to apply it, and then you wouldn't even need that denitrification and that nitrification inhibitor. This is some data from the western part of the state where I looked at a number of fields. 13 was a lucky number that year. And we looked at the use of nitropyrin, which was then sold as NSERV. And we looked at, of these fields, we had differences in yield ranging from -8 all the way up to about +34. So there were some very substantial responses, and then there were some in the middle that weren't very substantial. And there were actually a couple that were moderately negative. The bottom line is that on average, we had a 9% yield increase, considering even the ones that weren't so hot, and it was about 12 bushel an acre. This is some later work done by Greg Schwab with a new version of nitropyrin was created by Dow. It was Dow at that time. It's now been absorbed into Corteva. And Instinct was the new formulation, and it was suitable with UAN. He put some rates on 80 and 120, and then he put Instinct with UAN. And sure enough, he got really nice yield increases in terms of both at 80 and 120. These nitrification inhibitors work to reduce the amount of ammonium nitrogen converted to nitrate. NSERV has again been modified again, seeing it's now being sold by Corteva. And it's called Optinite technology. It's still a very good product. It works very well. But again, it's going to add cost to your nitrogen regime. It slows that conversion of ammonium to nitrate. Besides nitropyrin, we have another product that also has a good track record, and that's called Centuro. It's been around for a long time, but it wasn't commercialized until Koch bought the rights to it. And it's pronitridine. It's used with both anhydrous and UAN. It is not suitable, and dealers don't offer it on urea. A third product that also has a good track record is dicyandiamide. It's called DCD. It's been around for 30 years, used mostly in Europe. It's part of a formulation called Agritane Plus, which is added to urea or to UAN. And Super U is actually a form of urea where those two things are granulated together into the mix. These are mixtures, though. They contain NBPT along with the urease inhibitor. The new formulations for new uses, NSERV was only for anhydrous, and now we have Instinct for urea, UAN. And the rate is 0.5 pound to 1 pound per acre, active ingredient per acre. The reason it's on a per acre basis is you're really trying to knock down some biology, so you have to have enough product to kill off enough biology on an aerial basis. DCD and NBPT work more on the basis of pounds per ton, because what they're doing is they're actually more trying to protect the actual material itself. So they're formulated on pounds per ton. The other major loss we have in Kentucky is urea volatilizing ammonia. This is an example where, as I set this scenario up, it rained yesterday, it's sunny and breezy today. Does this situation call for a urease inhibitor? Well, if it's not going to rain for another week, yes, it probably does. Charlie Black at Iowa State did some good basic work looking at the amount of ammonia being volatilized from urea granules, both on the soil surface and from urea granules that were placed 1 inch below the soil surface. And you can see it's not zero even for the stuff that's 1 inch below the surface, although it gets closer to zero if you incorporate it with a disc. But for urea granules on the surface, things start to kick off pretty good at about 4 days. And then there's a rapid increase for the next 10 days, and then it tends to taper off, but it's not, it doesn't flatten. There's a fairly significant rate of loss for the next 20 days. The urease inhibitors act to knock down the behavior of urease in generating ammonia. Urease enzyme is a ubiquitous enzyme. It's on the surface of leaves and residues. It doesn't require a living cell to be active. It's an enzyme that we call exogenous. It does its thing even though it's outside a living cell. And the inhibitor blocks its activity and thereby slows it down. There's a number of products on the market that have efficacy. NBPT was first marketed as Agritain. It is now an off-patent active ingredient. And there's a lot of off-patent products containing NBPT on the market. Make sure if you use one of these that you're going to get somewhere between 1.2 to 1.6 pounds of NBPT AI per ton of either urea or UAN. NPPT, which is a related molecule, but it's not the same, is marketed in this country as Limus by BASF. There's a modified NBPT called the Duramide molecule. It's marketed as Anvol by Koch. It's a good product. It's a little more likely to work if your surface soil is a little more acid. It prevents the hydrolysis of the NBPT molecule. And again, Agritain Plus and Super U contain both NBPT and DCD, and therefore inhibit both urease and nitrification. But if you really only expect one of these losses, you probably don't want one of these products because you're paying money for an inhibitor you don't need. I'm going to re-emphasize this thing. The NBPT rate is per ton, not per acre, because you're protecting the fertilizer. It's typically at or slightly greater than 1.2 pounds of AI. Another way you may see it presented as 0.06% on a fertilizer weight basis, or 600 ppm AI. You will get some volatilization inhibition at rates as low as 0.02%, 0.4 pounds AI per ton. But that's really, it suppresses the overall total rate of volatilization. If you want to have that first week to 2 weeks of delay waiting for rain, you really need to have the higher rate of 0.6%, 0.06% AI. There has been a huge amount of work done at UK by Lloyd Murdoch, Greg Schwab, and myself looking at these inhibitors. On the urease inhibitor side, sometimes our responses go away as the N rate rises. In this example, you can see we've got a pretty substantial yield response to ESN and a minor one to Agritain here at 80 relative to this N-Guard, which never did work, and urea. Then you go to 120, again, you get some benefit to the inhibitor. But once you get to 160, you can't see anything. So at that point, you don't want to be applying the inhibitor because you're not getting any bang for the buck because you've got enough N out there to do the job. I saved the data from this trial because it really illustrates what happens if it rains on your study site 2 days after you apply it. You didn't know it was going to rain, but it rains, and the rain incorporated the urea, and there is no statistically significant difference among any of these. It didn't matter whether you had an inhibitor or not. You got the same yield. But sometimes you really need an inhibitor that works. This is a very comprehensive study. Ammonium nitrate was the gold standard here. Urea clearly was inferior. Agritane, Super U, and in ESN, which is a polymer-coated urea, all worked. Nutrisphere did not, and Nutrisphere is not recommended for use as a urease inhibitor. It's not recommended either as a nitrification inhibitor. There are some placement things that you can consider that will help. Anhydrous, of course, is always injected. UAN is interesting because it can be injected, and we prefer that over surface drivel bands, and we definitely prefer those over broadcasting if you really want to avoid volatilization losses. Urea is usually surface broadcast or broadcast incorporated, and it's favored because you get a lot more acres per day in most situations by broadcasting, top dressing, or just applying on the soil surface with dry urea. There are some things this season I'm recommending that growers avoid. Pelletized lime or suspension grade lime are often ag limes that have been ground up really fine, and they're a good product, but they cost so much per ton, they're not really relevant for most row crop situations. Liquid calcium products are often not even liming agents because they contain calcium salts. They might be a source of calcium, although I've never seen a calcium deficiency in the state of Kentucky in 40 years, but they're certainly not going to raise soil pH because they're not a liming agent. Dr. Ritchie just concluded a study last year with a lot of locations in a forage environment and got absolutely zero benefit to one of the common liquid calcium materials being sold on the market. I also recommend you avoid formulaic products like 1919 or 92330. Unless you need all three of the nutrients, I would recommend you use a custom blend based on the soil test. By the way, if anybody wonders, 92330 is made by taking 1846O and 0060 in a 50-50 ratio. But why would you pay a premium for that when in fact you can get varying quantities of those in a custom blend? Poultry litter is again an option if you need all three nutrients, but poultry litter is not as widely available this year right now because it's been, again, soaked up by the marketplace. The following four nutrients, sulfur, copper, iron, and manganese, should never be applied without a supporting plant tissue analysis, usually on the previous crop, to know that that field might be lowish, because there is no valid soil test for these nutrients in Kentucky. And by valid, I mean research has been done to correlate the soil test with crop response, and calibration has been done so to say, well, when the soil test is that low, this much of that nutrient needs to be applied to bring it up to snuff. That doesn't occur here. We don't have that data. We're trying to get data on sulfur, particularly for wheat, but we're not there yet. Low analysis or microbial products that are too good to be true as dry fertilizer replacements. Trust me, we haven't found any of these at work. We've looked at a number of different things, and I'm still confident that eventually soil biology is going to help us out here, but as of now, there is nothing that we recommend. We don't recommend the liquid humic acid, humus, or humate products. How can you add a product at a gallon up to 2 or 3 gallons per acre that might only contain, 10% carbon by weight to a soil that even at 0.2% carbon in the soil, which is pretty low, it's still got 2,000 pounds already out there. You just can't make a difference with that. And then there are some chemical and biological derived fertilizer additives that they say make the fertilizer nutrients more available. We haven't found any of these that have worked, things like Avail, some of these other things. This is another example of the analysis looks pretty good. 1185 isn't bad by weight, but the suggested acreage, suggested rates per acre range from, 1 to 2, 2 to 3 quarts per acre. Well, when you look at that, it's not much there. If 2 quart weighs 5 pounds, that's typical weight, you got 5 pounds per acre, then at 2 quarts, you're only getting about a half a pound of N, quarter pound of P, 4/10 of a pound of K. If you put on 10 gallons of the stuff to get up to 100 pounds, that's where the 1158 kicks in. And if you look above to what some of our crops would need at these yield levels, there's not much benefit even to 10 gallons of this stuff, because 10 gallons would only provide 5% of total uptake. And usually 1 to 2 quarts of a material like this is going to come in somewhere between $10 and $20 an acre. There are some new things, though, that we'd like growers to consider in the upcoming season. Start thinking about taking plant tissue samples, sending them in, learn how to take them, learn how to interpret the report results. I think that plant tissue analysis gives us some better information than just looking for nutrient deficiency symptoms, which can often take too long to develop. I also think we offer a salt test for boron at UK. I think for those situations where you're wondering if a field might be underperforming, you get poor pollination in corn, start a soil testing program for boron. It's a special request test, but you can ask for it. And if you get something that's low, like below a half pound, you might add a half pound of boron per acre through your fertility program. You can also use Solubor if it's foliar. It's a good product. It's compatible with a lot of other things, but because the spectrum of other things is infinite, you might want to jar test it to be sure, or have your spray dealer do the same thing. If you do pull a soil test, because we are looking at sulfur very intensely, you might especially consider in fields that have these reddish or red-brown subsoils, take a topsoil and a subsoil below 8-inch sample. We are strongly suspicious, excuse me, we are strongly suspicious that some of those deeper samples contain a high level of sulfate and are contributing to these situations where the topsoil soil test says the soil is low in S, but we never see a response. So my overall take-home points are these. We recommend you soil test because you need the data for a good nutrient management program. Particularly, the first thing to look at is applying any needed lime to improve soil nutrient availability, make sure roots can recover it, make sure the nitrogen cycling is going well. And until prices moderate, we don't recommend you apply maintenance fertilizer P or K, and note that the maintenance rates in UK's recommendations start at mid-medium soil test P or soil test K test levels. We recommend you avoid products that are too good to be true, because they often are. We recommend delayed N timing because that means in our soils, you get to use 35 to 40 pounds less nitrogen per acre, which is a real savings. Now that can be soaked up sometimes with equipment cost if you don't have the equipment you need. Avoid denitrification and volatilization losses of fertilizer N. You can use delayed timing to avoid denitrification. You can use injection or inhibitors to avoid volatilization, and you can also avoid denitrification losses with inhibitors if they're properly used. So thank you very much. And if you have any questions, please ask in the chat. And if you need to contact me, please take note. That's my email address, jgrove@uky.edu. Thank you.
Hey, Doc, this is Philip. Do you care to touch on some forage production just a little bit?
I have no problem with that. What do you need?
For pastures and hay fields, nitrogen, just kind of do what you did with soybeans with cool season grasses type stuff.
Okay, the thing we're recommending this year is number one, on pastures. Again, if you're already at the medium level, don't apply anything for P and K. On the nitrogen side, Chris Teutsch has reminded me that we can get better nitrogen use efficiency using a lower rate on cool season grasses if we avoid trying to encourage the first flush that you're going to get anyway. Wait until, maybe May 1 to put on nitrogen on cool season grasses, or May 15th, depending on where you are in the state, and then use the lower rate, say use 50, 60 pounds of N instead of the higher rate of N that's in that recommendation. The recommendation for N on cool season covers a range, okay? Move to the lowish, mid-low part of that range with that first dose of N on cool season grasses. We're still going to recommend the same amount of N for warm season grasses. We have more Bermuda grass out here in the western part of the state. So we're still going to recommend that. Now, moving into hay fields. It's what we find in many hay fields in Kentucky is particularly low levels of potassium. You're still going to need that, but what we recommend now is split it. Put part of it on for the first cutting and part of it on for the second cutting, and roughly, depending on how low the salt test is, roughly 50-50. If it's really low, you're going to have to put a little bit more on to make sure you get a good, a good overall tillering and establishment. But if it's a little bit better, you can maybe cut back somewhere between half and a third of your potash put on for the first cutting and put the other part on ahead of the second and third cuttings. We're still recommending liming as the first step in that scenario for both pastures and hay fields.
Thank you, sir.
That covered enough for it?
Yeah, I think so. And if we get some more questions come in, I'll get them. If you have questions, make sure you put them in the chat. First question, how much rain, whoops, I lost it. How much rain qualifies, or sorry, let's try it again. How much rain has to fall to qualify as rain to avoid nitrogen losses?
Well, the only loss that rainfall is going to help with is urea or UAN surface applied volatilization losses. You need at least a 1/4 inch, and it's better if it's a 1/2 inch. So it's better if it's half, but you need at least a 1/4 of an inch coming at you to make sure enough of that urea is incorporated into the soil and minimize the volatilization loss.
Okay, we're switching gears here just a little bit. On strawberries, how often would you check the soil?
Strawberries are a high value crop. You're lucky my home state is Michigan. We grow almost as many fruits and vegetables as California, but in strawberries, I strongly recommend that you check soil twice a year. Once ahead of fruiting in the spring, and another one to just see what it looks like as you're going out as the production season ends. What's the status of that soil? Because you want those plants to be healthy as you're going to take them through the winter, getting them ready for the next cycle.
Okay, how many split applications of fertilizer are economical for grass pastures and grass legume pastures? You may have covered that, but if you don't care to hit that one more time.
In a pasture environment, I don't recommend splitting P and K at all. I do sometimes recommend splitting N. It depends on how much grass you need. Chuck Doherty, when I was his office mate, near office mate for a while, he always used to stress that sometimes people apply fertilizer in a formulaic way, and then they end up with more grass than they can use, and it ends up going to waste. So the real question is nitrogen. I mean, I would put the P and K on according to soil test, but the real question in grass and grass legume pastures is nitrogen. With legumes in the mix, as long as it's 30-40% or more, you probably don't need any nitrogen at all. You just rely on the cycling of the nitrogen as the manure part of the root system of the legume dies out when it's been grazed, and that gets sucked up by the grass. But once you get to a mostly grass pasture, then you need to think about nitrogen. And again, there are about 2 times of application for sure in cool season grass. One is in support of the spring flush, and the other one is in support of the fall stockpiling period. And I'm going to assume you want to use that pasture twice for that purpose. So those are the two times we strongly recommend. But the timing of the first one can be not early mid-April. It can be delayed and used at a lower rate for early to mid-May. If you've already got a strong grass growth from, say, prior manure release of nitrogen, then you don't need as much, and you can wait on the second part of that for that first application to the cool season grasses.
Okay, Doc, while we're on hay fields, how many units of nitrogen do you recommend to get our best bang for the buck this year? And on grass
Again,
or grass hay fields, sorry.
Grass hay fields. Yeah. Are we talking cool season grass or warm season grass?
Mainly cool season.
Okay. For cool season grasses, we're still going to recommend not quite the full amount that we would normally, not the highest rate. And we're also going to recommend strongly that as you watch the weather, the first dose should go on in support of the first cutting, but it doesn't have to be the highest rate, because in theory, you've got some carryover from the previous year. If you've got enough moisture and you anticipate a good second cutting, then you need to have some more additional nitrogen in support of your second cutting, because the grass will have utilized a lot of what was made available earlier in the season, plus what you applied in support of that first cutting. So the second cutting may need, you may need, say, 50 pounds for the first cutting. You may need another 60 pounds, 70 pounds in support of the second cutting, as long as you've got the water, as long as you're going to get a good yield. The real trick is, on my farm, I go for 3 cuttings of cool season grass. And again, I really tend to run short of water. So what I tend to do is I tend to look very carefully at that, and I'll put on maybe another 30, 40 units of N in support of my third cutting. And then finally, because I want to encourage tillering in the fall, late fall, early winter, prior to the next season, I usually put on another 30 to 40 units of N in late, say somewhere between Thanksgiving and the second week in December, because what I want to do is I want to set that cool season grass up to tiller profusely in the spring. That's a new thing. Teutsch is actually doing more research on it right now. But our initial observations, which actually come out of turf grass, it turns out that turf people have been using this trick to set up lawns to be really thick and leafy in the spring, this very late application of nitrogen. And it's not very much, 20, 30, 50, 30, 40 units of N, pounds of N per acre. But it works pretty well. And it also helps give us more bang for the buck if we do have to apply more N in the early spring for the first cutting, because we've set that cool season grass up with some extra tillers, some extra stems to make grass hay with.
Hey, Doc, going back to the soil sample, can you touch briefly on CEC, cation exchange capacity?
Well, the first thing people need to know is the CEC on your soil test lab report is one of the least valuable numbers on the report. It is used by the soil test lab to get a rough idea of what your soil buffer capacity is. But in reality, the lime requirement is determined by a straight up chemical technique called a buffer pH. A lot of soils in Kentucky fall in a fairly narrow range of somewhere between 9 and 18 milliequivalents per 100 grams. Now, if you come from one of the glacial till states, you can have a field that's 6 in CEC at one end of the field, really sandy, and 30 really clay at the other end of the field within an 80-acre field. But that's not relevant here. Some people like to talk about CEC, but we've never found anything of value relative to a straight up soil test for potassium, let's say. Some people will try to tell you, oh, you need to have a certain ratio of cations. There has never been a single research paper that has ever shown a benefit to the concept of nutrient balance, more particularly the cation saturation ratio on the CEC. We put it there because we use it to roughly calculate the level of acidity or the level as a backstop to the buffer pH to make sure we're on track when we make a lime recommendation. But it's not something you can use for nitrogen. You should never use it for phosphorus or potassium relative to a regular soil test result.
Any other questions we have? You can put them in the chat or feel free to unmute and ask them in person. Well, Doc, thank you so much for taking time and helping us deal with some of these high fertilizer prices, coming up with some strategies. Also, this fall, if you're interested, we're working on doing a fertilizer academy and talking over the big three, NP and K, liming, and micronutrients, and a few other things. Like I said, we're still in the planning process of this, and hopefully we'll have something rolled out to you this fall. April, do you have anything you need to add? Go ahead, Jock. Sorry.
Oh, I was just going to say I'd be happy to help in any way I can.
Thank you. We greatly appreciate that. And like Philip said, we'll get more information, a flyer and everything out on that soon. So keep watch for that. Other than that, if you have any last minute questions, you're welcome to put them in the chat box or come off mute while making some last minute announcements. Just to know, I will be sending out an email either tomorrow or the day after. We have a busy week with programs this week, so it may be later this week, but we'll try as quickly as possible to get you the link from tonight's presentation. I think Dr. Grove is also going to send us his presentation as well that I'll include in the email. And also, I'll send a link to the AGR1 publication. I know some of you all have seen that, but we've got some folks on this evening that I know that haven't. Part of the registration process, we asked if folks had taken a soil test in the past, and overwhelmingly, the most of the folks have, and we have a few that haven't, and that's okay. That's great. This is your opportunity to definitely to learn more about your soil and be able to do your soil testing. Each of the extension offices can have the supplies, the bags and such like that, and information on how to take a proper soil sample. Also, I won't give a price on it because each office has different budgets and all that kind of thing. So it can range anywhere from $5 to $10 per sample. So just check with your local extension office on that. And other than that, anybody, any last minute questions or anything? We had a comment about a great program. Thank you, Dr. Grove, for presenting.
Hey, Doc, got one more question for you.
My pleasure. Yeah, go ahead.
You mentioned a lot about poultry manure. We have a lot of beef farms up in this part of the state. What's your opinion on beef manure?
Beef manure is, well, poultry litter is variable, but beef manure, depending on how it's managed or what's in it, can be highly variable. So it is a good nutrient source. You definitely should get it analyzed before you use it so that you understand, how much you have there. Now, generally speaking, relative to poultry litter, the nitrogen is there, but it's going to be less available. It has to be mineralized. Part of the nitrogen in poultry litter is actually kind of like urea. It's pretty immediately available. Beef has less of that. Potassium is equally available in all these manure sources because it's not part of the organic matter. It's attached to it, but it's not part of it. So it just moves off into the soil very quickly. Phosphorus is also intermediate. We like to say in poultry litter that, about 50% of the N and 80% of the P and 100% of the K is going to be available to this year's crop. With beef, it's going to be more like 25% of the N and 60% of the P and 100% of the K are going to be available to this year's crop. It's a good source of nutrients. By the way, it also tends to be, although that's not a perfect story, it tends to be more dilute. There tends to be more organic matter, straw, bedding, whatever, in beef manure than there is in poultry litter. So you're going to be hauling perhaps more to the field for a little bit less nutrients per ton. But again, that's so variable. On my own farm, I have I like to bale graze, but during the winter I have problems on my soils. I can't bale graze. So I have a feeding area and I clean off the feeding area and I haul that manure and put it on my hay fields. And I admit, I don't expect the N and the P to become available necessarily for the first cutting, but I know it'll help me out with my second and third cutting. So I take that into account.
Sounds good. Thank you, sir. And if you want your manure tested, we can do that at the university. I believe it is a $25 charge on that one. Last minute call for any other questions. Well, if not, Doc, thank you for taking time. Guys, be safe. If you need us, contact your local agent, and everybody have a great night.